The orc assassin came through the kitchen window as easily as smoke. Brant didn't run. He didn't call for help. He just leaned on his crutch, too tired for fear. The knife was pointed at his chest, but then her eyes fell to his missing leg, the worn crutch, the single bowl on his table. She lowered the blade. Instead of killing him, she asked for soup. Brant was once a soldier in the frontier wars, one of the few who came back alive but not whole. His leg was left in a muddy trench, his brothers in arms buried in foreign soil. Now he lived in a crumbling cabin on the edge of nowhere, with a crutch and a silence that had lasted 3 years. He never expected a visitor, let alone an orc assassin. But what she said after she lowered her knife changed everything. She wasn't just a killer. She was a witness who had refused to kill, and now her own guild wanted her dead. The two of them, a crippled veteran and a marked traitor, formed an unlikely pact that would turn hunters into prey. The soup was cold, the last of a batch he had made 3 days earlier, but the orc drank it like it was the first meal she had seen in a week. Bruises darkened her arms, and a deep gash ran along her ribs, poorly bandaged with cloth torn from her own tunic. Brant watched from the other side of the rickety table, his crutch propped against the chair. The same chair he had not offered her, because offering a seat implies you have the upper hand. He didn't. She had the knife. She had the strength. And yet, she was shaking. Her name was Vara. She was a shade of the Broken Circle, an assassin guild that operated in the shadows of the frontier wars, answering to whoever paid in gold or grain. For 3 years she had been their most reliable operative, silent, efficient, unquestioning, but the contract on Brant changed everything. She had been sent to kill a witness, a soldier who had seen something in the war that certain commanders wanted buried forever. Brant was supposed to die with the rest of his unit, but he crawled out of that trench alive, and that survival was an inconvenience powerful men could not afford. Vara had tracked him to the cabin expecting a threat, a trained fighter with nothing to lose. Instead, she found a man who had already lost everything, his leg, his brothers, his reason to fight. She watched him for 2 days before she made her move, hidden in the tree line, studying his routines. He never barred the door. He never looked over his shoulder. He never even glanced at the rusted blade hanging on the wall. That blade hadn't been touched in years. When she finally slipped through the window, blade in hand, she expected defiance. She got stillness. And the stillness broke something in her. "I was given one order," she told him that first night. "Eliminate the target." "But the target doesn't exist. You're already a ghost." "So I made a choice, and now my own guild wants me dead." The Broken Circle does not tolerate refusal. Within hours of her failing to report back, they would have marked her as a traitor and dispatched a hunter to clean up the mess. She had run, but the hunter caught her scent. The wounds she carried were from an ambush 3 miles from the cabin. She barely escaped, and now she was cornered. Brant listened without speaking. He understood the logic of violence, the way soldiers did. He also understood that a hunter closing in meant both of them were in the crosshairs. If the guild found Vara in his cabin, they would not ask questions. They would burn it down with him inside. So he made the only calculation that mattered. "You need a place to hide," he said. "I need someone who can hold a blade while I hold a crutch. We help each other. Or we die alone." The deal was struck in the dim light of a single tallow candle. She would guard the cabin against the first wave of hunters, buying time to plan a permanent escape. He would guide her through the northern passes, a route he knew from his scouting days, one that could get them to the free territories beyond the guild's reach. But they had to move fast. The hunter who ambushed her was named Kren, a tracker with 12 confirmed kills and no record of failure. He would already be closing the net, and the only thing worse than his skill was his patience. For 3 days, Vera's wounds mended and Brant prepared. He dug out the old maps, the dried rations, the tinderbox from his soldiering pack that he had never been able to throw away. Vara sharpened the rusted blade until it gleamed. They spoke little. The silence was not awkward but functional. Two people who had learned that words were a currency best spent on things that mattered. She told him about the contract, about the crime he had supposedly witnessed, a massacre of civilians that had been blamed on a rival clan but had been ordered by his own commanders. He told her about the trench, the artillery shell that took his leg, the field medic who dragged him out, and the letter that arrived months later, discharging him into a world that had no place for a crippled witness. The hunter found them on the 4th night. Brant was asleep in his chair when Vara's hand clamped over his mouth, a sound outside, the intentional snap of a branch that only an amateur would make. Kren was not an amateur. He wanted them to know he was there, to feel the fear before the blade came. Vara pressed a second blade into Brant's hand, a small throwing knife, lighter than his crutch, infinitely more useful. Then she vanished into the shadows of the kitchen. The front door splintered inward. Kren stepped through, not the orc Brant had expected, but a human, thin as a wire, with eyes that reflected the dying embers like a cat's. He smiled at Brant. The traitor is here. And the witness, too. 2 loose ends. One clean night. Brant didn't move. The knife was in his palm. The crutch was across the room. He was already dead. But Vara came from above, dropping from the rafters with a blade in each hand. The first strike drove Kren back. The second opened a line across his ribs. The hunter laughed and pulled a second sword from his back, a curved blade that caught the firelight. "She chose you," Kren said, dancing away from her slashes. "A cripple. The broken circle will find that hilarious before they skin you both." Vara pressed the attack. Brant crawled toward his crutch. The room was chaos, shadows and steel and the sharp smell of blood. Kren was faster than Vara and fresher. Her wounds were still raw, and he knew it. He batted her aside with a blow that shattered a chair, then turned his blade toward Brant. Time slowed. Brant's hand closed on the crutch, and he swung it like a club, the worn wood connecting with Kren's knee with a crack that was not just wood. The hunter stumbled. Vara was on him in that heartbeat, driving her blade through his shoulder, pinning him to the floor. But outside, torches appeared in the tree line. The hunter was only the first. 4 more figures were approaching the cabin, silhouetted by the flames. They ran. Brant could not sprint, but Vara half carried him through the back door into the cold night, her arm under his arm, the maps clutched against his chest. Behind them, flames licked the roof of the cabin as the guild hunters torched it, a signal that the hunt had been botched. By the time the hunters realized their quarry had slipped away, Brant and Vara were already a mile into the forest, the crutch abandoned in the mud, replaced by a shoulder that did not complain and a grip that did not loosen. The northern passes waited. So did the truth of what Brant had seen, a truth that would unmake the men who had built their peace on a lie. And the broken circle was only the beginning. The northern passes were brutal, a winding trail of ice-slicked stone and razor-thin ledges that had claimed more travelers than any battlefield. Brant had crossed them once before as a scout before the war, but his memories were sharp enough to navigate. Vara moved ahead, her amber eyes cutting through the darkness, the hunting knife never leaving her hand. Behind them, the smoke from their burning cabin was a distant smudge on the horizon, a beacon for every tracker the broken circle could spare. They had a head start, but not a large one. By dawn, they reached the first checkpoint, a collapsed watchtower from an older conflict. Brant slumped against the stones, his remaining leg trembling from the march. Vara tore strips from her tunic to rebandage his raw skin where the crutch had been lost and her shoulder had chafed. She had not spoken in hours, her focus entirely on the path, but now she looked at him with a question she had been holding since the cabin. What exactly did you see in that trench? What was worth killing a whole unit to keep quiet? Brant closed his eyes. It was not a trench, he said. It was a valley. Green fields, a village, families. His unit was ordered to secure it, but when they arrived, the village was already burning. Not from enemy fire, from friendly fire. His own commanders had authorized a scorched earth operation using a forbidden incendiary weapon to blame it on the rival Morngal clan. It was meant to look like a war crime, but it was a false flag. Brant's unit walked into the aftermath. Some of them realized the truth, and the order came down, no witnesses. The artillery strike that took Brant's leg was meant to kill everyone. He survived by accident, buried under bodies. When he was recovering in a field hospital, a major came to visit, not to commend his bravery, but to check if he remembered. Brant played dumb, said the shell had scrambled his memory. The major seemed satisfied, but the discharge papers arrived the next week, a crippled soldier sent home with a pension and a warning: if you talk, you'll be silenced. For 3 years, Brant stayed quiet, not because he was afraid, but because he had nothing left to fight for. Now he had a reason: Vara and the hunters who would kill her for showing mercy. Vara listened, her face unreadable. The broken circle was hired by your commanders, she said. The contract wasn't just to eliminate a witness, it was to ensure the false flag never came to light, because if it does, a fragile peace between the human kingdoms and the orc clans will shatter. The war ended because both sides blamed the massacre on Morngal, and Morngal was crushed. But if the truth emerged, the real perpetrators would face retribution, and half the frontier lords would be tried for war crimes. The entire political map would shift. Brant wasn't just a target, he was a key to a revolution. But they were not the only ones who knew the truth. A rogue archivist named Edris had been collecting evidence for years, hiding in the Free Territories, waiting for a soldier who could testify. Vara had heard rumors. If they could reach Idris before the guild caught them, they could expose the conspiracy and turn the hunters into the hunted. But the guild had its best tracker still alive. Kren had survived the shoulder wound. By the time they cleared the passes, Vara spotted a fresh set of hoofprints in the mud. Not horses, but war rams, the guild's mountain mounts. The hunter was ahead of them, not behind. He had circled around and was setting a trap at the only bridge across the Black Gorge. They had to detour through the Howling Caves, a labyrinth of tunnels that miners abandoned decades ago, supposedly haunted by the spirits of those who died in a collapse. The caves were dark, wet, and echoing. Brant could barely walk, but Vara rigged a makeshift torch from a dead branch and resin, and they stumbled into the darkness. The temperature dropped. Sounds played tricks: the drip of water, the skitter of rats, the distant groan of shifting earth. Then they found the bones. Not miners, but soldiers, armor rusted, weapons brittle. A skirmish had happened here, a forgotten fight from the war, and among the remains, a sealed leather satchel, still intact. Brant opened it and found a journal belonging to a captain from his own unit, one who had also survived the massacre and fled. The journal detailed the false flag, the orders, the names of the commanders who gave them. It was the hard evidence they needed. But the cave was not empty. A low growl rumbled from a side tunnel. A creature, something twisted by the dark magic that lingered in the caves. A skittering mass of fur and claws lunged at them. Vara fought it with a torch and blade, driving it back while Brant dragged himself toward a narrow passage. The creature was not alone. A second shape emerged behind them. They were trapped. Vara grabbed Brant and pushed him into a crevice, then turned to face the beasts. She used the torch to ignite a pocket of gas that had seeped from the rock, the explosion blinding and deafening, collapsing part of the ceiling. In the chaos, the creatures fled, but the tunnel was filling with debris. Vara pulled Brant through just as a slab of stone sealed the entrance. They were alive, but the caves were now their only path forward, and the sound of the collapse would have alerted anyone above. They emerged on the other side of the mountain 2 days later, half-starved, covered in rock dust and blood. The bridge still loomed ahead, but now they saw Kren's war ram tethered at the edge, its saddle empty. He had gone into the caves after them. They had to cross the gorge fast. The bridge was a swaying rope and plank construction, treacherous for a one-legged man. Vara went first, testing the ropes. Brant started across, his arms aching, the satchel with the journal tied to his chest. Halfway across, an arrow whistled past his ear and embedded in the railing. Kren had emerged from the tree line, bow in hand, his shoulder bandaged but his aim steady. He shouted, "The traitor and the cripple. You think you can run?" Vara drew her blade and ran along the bridge back toward Kren, while Brant continued forward. Another arrow, then a third. Vara deflected one, took the other in her leg, but didn't stop. She reached the near side and engaged Kren in close combat. Swords clashed, the hunter taunting her, revealing that the guild had sent reinforcements, a whole squad of shades, and they were converging on the gorge. Vara fought with a fury born of 3 days without food, and a wound that was slowing her down. Brant reached the far side and turned. Helpless, he saw Kren's blade slice across Vara's arm, disarming her. Then a massive figure stepped from the rocks behind Kren. Not an orc, but a heavily armored human with a guild insignia, the guild master of the Broken Circle. A woman with a face like a blade who had come personally to finish the job. And she held not a sword, but a document, a scroll with an official seal. She called out to Brant, "You have something that belongs to us. The captain's journal. Hand it over, and I'll let the girl live. Refuse, and she dies slowly, and you'll watch before I throw you into the gorge." Brant's hand went to the satchel. The journal was their only proof. Without it, Idris couldn't help them. But Vara's life hung in the balance. The guildmaster smiled, a thin line of certainty. She knew Brant had no leverage. The hunters had won. Or so it seemed. But then Brant looked at Vara, and she gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. She had a plan. She had always had a plan. That's when Brant remembered the satchel's other contents, a small vial of explosive powder, part of the captain's emergency kit. He had it in his hand. He just needed a distraction. He held up the journal, tearing out a page and letting the wind catch it over the gorge. "You want it? Come and get it." The guildmaster stepped forward, and Kren moved to grab Vara. In that moment, Vara threw a handful of dust and grit into Kren's eyes, then rolled toward the bridge's anchor rope, slashing it with a hidden knife. The bridge lurched. Brant lit the powder and tossed the vial onto the bridge planks. A chain reaction, the rope snapping, the bridge falling into the void, cutting off both sides. Kren and the guildmaster were on the far side, while Vara and Brant were on the near side, but the explosion also dislodged a boulder that crashed down onto the war ram, spooking it and sending the guildmaster tumbling. In the chaos, Vara grabbed Brant, and they vanished into the trees, the satchel still secured. They had won the escape, but the guildmaster's words echoed. The broken circle was now fully mobilized, and they had just made it personal. And deep in the forest, a new sound reached them. Drums. Not guild drums. War drums. A Morngal warband, remnants of the destroyed clan, had also been tracking the truth. They wanted the same evidence to avenge their own. Now Brant and Vara were caught between two armies, and the only sanctuary was the Free Territories, still 100 miles away through contested land. The hunter, the guildmaster, the Morngal, all converging. And the journal was starting to be heavier than a weapon. But Brant looked at Vara's bleeding leg, at the determination in her eyes, and knew that they would not stop. He had found something he thought he'd lost in the trench, a reason to live. And for an orc who had once been sent to kill him, she had become that reason. The truth was about to break like a dam, and the flood would drown everyone who tried to hold it back. But first, they had to survive the night. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, a lone figure with a lantern raised a hand in greeting. It was Idris, the archivist, who had heard the explosion and come to find them. The final piece of the puzzle was waiting, but so were the eyes of a dozen hidden archers, Morngal scouts who had been tracking Idris too. The standoff was about to begin. Idris raised the lantern higher, the pale glow catching the sharp angles of a face that had spent too many years hiding. He was human, older, with a scholar's stoop and a soldier's eyes. Behind him, the darkness shifted, and a dozen Morngal warriors stepped into the light, their war paint streaked with ash. Their weapons not drawn, but not sheathed either. Their leader, a woman with a scar that bisected her face from brow to jaw, spoke first. "You have the journal." Vara tightened her grip on her blade, but Brant put a hand on her arm. He recognized the insignia on the woman's pauldron, the shattered horn of Morngal, a clan that had been declared extinct after the war. "You survived," he said. "The massacre was not our doing," the leader said. "We have wandered as ghosts ever since, trying to prove it. That journal is the evidence we need to clear our name and bring the true monsters to justice. Hand it over, and we will let you live. Refuse, and we will take it from your corpses." Idris stepped between them. "You'll do no such thing, Kalen. These two are not your enemies. They have the testimony of a surviving soldier, the same testimony that will corroborate what you know. If you kill them, the truth dies with them." He turned to Brant. "I've been tracking your story for 2 years. I knew you were the last witness. When the Broken Circle took the contract, I feared you were already dead. But now you're here, and we have a chance to end this." Kalen snorted. "You trust a human scholar? The same kind of creature who wrote the histories that branded us butchers. Why should we trust him or you?" Brant held up the journal. "Because this is a captain's log. It names the commanders, the officers, the exact orders. It matches your own intelligence, I assume. If we work together, we can get this to the Allied Council before the Guild silences us all. That's what you want, isn't it? Vengeance through truth." Kalen's scarred face twitched. "We want justice. Not for us, for the dead. But the council is corrupt. Half the lords sitting there authorized the false flag. They will burn that journal the moment it touches their table. We need a different forum. We need the free assembly, where the independent clans and exiled human lords hold sway." Idris nodded. "The free assembly convenes in 3 days at the neutral ground of Broken Rock. If we can present the journal there, in open session, with witnesses, it will be broadcast across the territories. No one can ignore it. But the Broken Circle knows this. They'll be waiting for us on every road. And they have support from the very lords we're trying to expose. This is a suicide mission." Vara, who had been silent, spoke up. "I was one of them. The Guild has protocols, They will send waves of hunters, but they are also bound by reputation. If we can turn their own rules against them, we might buy time. The guildmaster, she's obsessed with cleaning up her operatives personally. She'll come for us herself, and that means she'll be predictable. A plan began to form in the cold forest clearing. They would split into two groups. Edris, Kalen, and a small escort would carry a decoy journal toward the nearest garrison, drawing the hunters' attention, while Brant, Vara, and 3 Morngul scouts would take the real journal through the treacherous wildwood to Broken Rock. If the decoy succeeded, the hunters would waste hours chasing a ghost. If it failed, the decoy team would be slaughtered. Edris volunteered without hesitation. Kalen assigned her second in command, a silent warrior named Thera, to guide the second team. But as they finalized the route, a Morngul scout rushed into the clearing, breathless, riders, coming fast, not guild. Royal lancers with the king's crest. The situation had just escalated beyond the frontiers. The king's personal guard was involved. That meant the conspiracy went higher than previously thought, perhaps as high as the throne. The lancers would have no interest in arrest or due process. They would execute everyone on sight to silence the evidence. Now the race was not just against the guild, but against the crown itself. Vara pulled Brant aside. If the king is involved, then even the assembly might not be safe. We need to get the journal to a public figure who cannot be silenced. An archbishop, a foreign ambassador, someone with the power to call for a full inquiry. Brant thought back to his briefing before the war. There was one name, Ambassador Seraphine of the Eastern Reach, a human noble who had argued against the war and had been placed under house arrest for her troubles. She was now in the capital, but if they could reach her, she could invoke diplomatic immunity and demand a hearing. But getting to the capital meant crossing 200 miles of hostile territory, with both the guild and the king's men hunting them. Edris shook his head. The capital is a fortress. You'll never get in, let alone reach the ambassador. But there is an alternative, a neutral airship, the Cloudbreaker, chartered by the Merchants Guild, which makes a supply run from the border town of Ironweld to the capital in 2 days. If we can get you aboard that ship, you can bypass the ground forces entirely. Ironweld is 3 days' march to the east across the Ashfield, a dead land where nothing grows and no one watches. But the Ashfield is also haunted by the spirits of soldiers who died in the false flag. Kalen spat. Ghosts are the least of our worries. The Ashfield is patrolled by the king's wardens, automatons that sense movement and report back. They're not truly alive, but they can kill. We'll have to move at night, and pray the cloud cover holds. The group made their final farewells. Edris clasped Brant's arm. I've spent a decade waiting for this moment. Don't let it die in the Ashfield. Then the decoy team mounted up and rode west, making as much noise as possible. Within the hour, the sounds of pursuit echoed through the trees. The real team headed east, into the desolation. The Ashfield lived up to its name, a vast expanse of gray soil, charred tree stumps, and a silence so deep it felt like a weight on the ears. The spirits were not visible, but Brant could feel them, cold spots that passed through his chest, whispers that came from no direction, and the occasional flicker of blue light on the horizon. Vara walked close to him, her shoulder his crutch again. The Morngul scouts moved like shadows, Thera at point, her hand never leaving her bow. On the second night, they encountered a warden, a towering construct of black iron and pulsing crystal, its single eye scanning the wastes with a red beam. They hid in a narrow gully, holding their breath. The warden paused, its sensor probing the rim, then moved on. But as it did, a smaller probe, a floating orb, detached from its back and began spiraling outward. It would find them in seconds. Thera acted quickly, casting a smoke bomb that scrambled the orb's sensors, and they scurried to a hidden cave entrance she had used years before. The cave was a Morngul safe house, stocked with dried meat and clean water. They would rest for a few hours. In the cave, Brant opened the journal and read some passages aloud. The captain's handwriting was erratic, the words of a man who knew he was writing his own death warrant. He described the meeting 2 days before the massacre. General Vorath, the king's cousin, had personally given the order to use the incendiary weapon on a civilian village, staging it to look like Morngul sorcery. The goal was to ignite a war of extermination, not just to defeat a clan, but to seize their lands and resources. The entire conflict, which had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, was a lie constructed by a few dozen men at the top. The fallout, if this got out, would collapse the kingdom. Every soldier who had fought, every family that had lost a child, every orc who had been driven into exile, would demand retribution. The kingdom would tear itself apart. Vera listened, her face unreadable. "This is bigger than my guild," she said. The broken circle was bought with coin from the same treasury that funded the war. They are an extension of the king's will. I was a tool of the same machine that killed my own people. Brant thought back to the barn, to the moment she lowered her knife. It had seemed like mercy then. Now he saw it for what it was, the first crack in a wall of lies that had stood for a decade. She had been sent to kill him to preserve that wall. Instead, she was about to shatter it. Dawn broke over the ashfield, and the team resumed their march. Ironweld was less than a day away, but the air grew heavy with the smell of smoke. Not ashfield smoke, but fresh burning. Thera crested a ridge and signaled urgently. Below, Ironweld's outskirts were in flames. The airship tower, a skeletal structure of wood and canvas, was still standing, but the town was under siege. The king's lancers had beaten them there, and they had brought a full battalion. The Cloudbreaker was being loaded with supplies by frantic merchants, their guards forming a thin defensive line. Vara calculated. The ship will not leave without its cargo. If we can hold off the lancers long enough, we might slip aboard. The Morngul scouts prepared for a last stand. Brant knew he would slow them down. He told Vara to go without him, to get the journal aboard, to finish the mission. She refused. "We do this together, or not at all." They charged into the chaos using the smoke as cover. The lancers were skilled, but spread thin, fighting the merchant guards on one front and the sudden appearance of Morngul warriors at their flank. Thera's arrows found their marks. Vara cut a path through a squad of cavalry, her blade dancing. Brant, propped against a barrel, took a crossbow and fired at a lancer officer, buying Vara precious seconds. As the Cloudbreaker's engines roared to life and the mooring ropes were cast off, Vara grabbed Brant and leaped for the loading ramp. Thera and one other scout followed. They were aboard, but the ship was already under fire. A lancer's flaming arrow struck the engine housing. The ship shuddered, gaining altitude but trailing black smoke. They had escaped the ground forces only to find themselves in a crippled vessel, with the capital still 40 hours away and the king's aerial guard alerted by now. The captain of the Cloudbreaker, a grizzled dwarf named Morik, greeted them with a mix of terror and awe. "You've brought the whole kingdom down on my head," he grumbled. "But I've no love for the king. He taxed my trade routes to death. If that journal's real, I'll fly you through the abyss itself. But we need repairs. Our engine's bleeding pressure. We'll have to set down briefly at the skyport of Turn's Rest, a neutral hub high in the peaks. It's risky, but it's the only place with spare parts." At Turn's Rest, the situation grew even more dire. The skyport was a bustling hangar carved into a mountain, now swarming with royal agents trying to identify the Cloudbreaker. The ship's crew hid the fugitives in a cargo hold while repairs were made. But a whispered rumor passed through the port. The king himself was en route to the capital for an emergency council, and he had declared Brant a traitor, Vara a rogue, and the Morngal a resurrected threat. Every lawman in the region was on high alert. The noose was tightening. In the cargo hold, Brant finally had a moment to look at Vara. Her wounds were healing, but the exhaustion was deep. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "You could have vanished, left me to die." "I told you," she said. "I made a choice. I was tired of being a ghost, killing for men who didn't even know my name. You were the first person in years who didn't beg, didn't fight, just waited. You accepted me. That's worth more than any guild coin." The ship lifted off again, engines repaired but radar now pinging with incoming interceptors. 3 small, fast royal skimmers. Morik's voice crackled over the intercom. "They're demanding we land for inspection. If we don't comply, they'll board us by force. We can't outrun them, but we can take a gamble. There's a storm front building over the Great Rift. We can fly into it. They won't follow into that chaos. But there's a real chance we'll be torn apart." Brant looked at Vara, then at the journal. "Do it," he said. "The truth is worth the storm." The Cloudbreaker plunged into the maelstrom, lightning arcing around them, winds battering the hull. The skimmers peeled off. Inside the ship, alarms screamed. The cargo hold crew strapped themselves in. Thera held onto a support beam, chanting a Morngal death prayer. Vara held Brant's hand, her grip strong. Through the porthole, a momentary gap in the clouds revealed the capital, gleaming in the distance. They were going to make it, if the ship didn't break apart first. Then the hull breached. A lightning strike, a shred of metal, and a cargo bay door buckled. 2 Morngal scouts were sucked out into the void. Thera barely held on. The ship's altitude dropped. Morik's voice cut through, "We're losing pressure. Emergency landing in the river. Brace." The ship crashed into the shallow waters of the Silver River, just outside the capital's outer walls. The impact threw everyone to the deck. Brant blacked out for a second. When he came to, Vara was dragging him from the wreckage. The journal, miraculously, was still dry in its oilskin satchel. The ship was sinking. The crew scrambled for shore. Thera had a broken arm but would live. Morik was injured. The capital's guards were already on the riverbank, torches and swords drawn. But among the guards was a figure in diplomatic robes, flanked by 2 armed servants. Ambassador Seraphine. She had been alerted by Adris's network, and she had come to the river herself. She raised a hand, and the guards hesitated. By order of the Eastern Reach, she declared, "These individuals are under my protection. They carry evidence of crimes against humanity that must be heard by the full assembly." The royal guards protested, but the diplomatic seal was law. Brant, Vara, Thera, and the journal were escorted into the embassy. For the first time in weeks, they were safe. But the ambassador's expression was grim. "The assembly convenes tomorrow. The king will try to block the evidence, and his assassins are already inside the city. We have 1 night to prepare your testimony, and 1 chance to bring the truth to light. If we fail, this embassy will fall, and you will hang by morning." Brant held the journal in his hands, the weight of it now almost unbearable. He looked at Vara, the orc who had asked for soup instead of his life, now the only person he trusted with his own. Tomorrow, they would step into the heart of the monster's lair, and the world would either shatter or be set right. The stage was set for the final act. The ambassador's study was a vault of polished wood and maps, a sanctuary within the embassy's fortified walls. Seraphine listened to Brant's account without interruption, her quill scratching notes on parchment. When he finished, she set the quill down and folded her hands. The journal names General Vorath, the king's cousin. That is a direct line to the throne. Presenting this will not merely embarrass the crown, it will destroy it. Are you prepared for that? Brant nodded. He had spent 3 years in silence, buried in a cabin, waiting for death. Now he was alive in a way he had not been since before the war. Vara stood by the window, watching the capital's lights flicker in the storm. The broken circle will try to kill him before he speaks, she said. They did not send Kren for nothing. The guildmaster is in the city. I can feel it. Seraphine's chief of security, a grizzled veteran named Halden, placed a map of the assembly hall on the table. The session is at noon. The king will be present, as will all the lords of the council. The public gallery is packed with merchants, clerics, and foreign observers. If you present the journal in open session, the king cannot move against you without inciting a riot. But there are a dozen ways to be stopped before you reach the podium. We'll use the embassy's underground passage to enter the hall through the archives. Once you're in the chamber, immunity is technically absolute, but the king's personal guard has been known to disregard protocol. The night was long. Thera and the remaining Morngull scout kept watch with Halden's men. Brant, unable to sleep, found Vara on a balcony overlooking the river. The air was cold, the sky clearing. She turned when he approached, her amber eyes reflecting the first light of false dawn. I was sent to kill you, she said, and instead I found my name. You gave me that. I gave you nothing, Brant replied. You chose to put down the knife. That was your own soul, not mine. He paused. Whatever happens tomorrow, you are not a ghost anymore. Neither am I. He took her hand, the green skin warm against his pale fingers. It was not a romantic gesture, but a pact. Two outcasts who had found a reason to live in each other's existence. An hour before noon, an alarm sounded. Halden burst into the safe room. Guild assassins breached the outer wall. They're in the embassy garden, disguised as servants. We have minutes. The ambassador was already moving, her guards forming a protective cordon. Vara and Brant were rushed through a hidden door behind a bookcase, down a spiral staircase into a damp tunnel lit by flickering torches. The sounds of fighting echoed above. Halden stayed behind to hold the passage. Go, he said. I'll buy you the time. They ran, Brant hobbling on a makeshift crutch, Vara supporting him. The tunnel ended at a heavy iron door. Seraphine pressed a crest into a recessed panel, and the door swung open into the archives beneath the assembly hall. Dust and old parchment filled the air. They climbed stone stairs into a side corridor, the rumble of the gathering crowd vibrating through the walls. A page met them and guided them to a holding room just off the main chamber. Through a narrow window, Brant could see the assembly, a vast circular hall with tiered benches, hundreds of figures in robes and armor, a throne on a raised dais where the king sat, a golden circlet on his brow, his face a mask of cold authority. The session began with routine business, trade disputes, border adjustments. Seraphine stood at her designated seat and requested emergency recognition under Article 17 of the Continental Charter, the clause that allowed the introduction of evidence of war crimes. A murmur rippled through the hall. The king's chancellor objected, citing lack of notice, but the assembly speaker, a neutral elder from the Free Territories, noted that Seraphine's diplomatic immunity granted her the floor. The king's eyes narrowed. He could not deny her publicly. The doors opened, and Brant limped into the hall. Vara walked beside him, her green skin and orc features drawing gasps and shouts. Thera followed, carrying the oilskin satchel containing the journal. Brant approached the central podium. He leaned heavily on his crutch, his voice at first a rasp, then strengthening. He told them everything: the valley, the burning village, the false flag, the order to eliminate his unit. He held up the journal. This was written by Captain Elric Darren, who witnessed the planning meeting and recorded the directive given by General Vorath. By order of the king himself. The massacre that was blamed on the Morngul clan was a fabrication to seize their lands and justify a war of conquest. The chamber erupted. Lords leaped to their feet, some in fury, some in disbelief. The Morngul delegation, a handful of survivors who had come as observers, cried out in vindication. The king rose, his voice cutting through the noise. This is treason. A crippled soldier, a rogue assassin, and a fanatical archivist spreading lies. Guards, seize them. But the assembly speaker slammed his staff. The witness has presented physical evidence. The journal will be examined by the council's scribes before any arrest is made. Sit down, Your Majesty, or you will be removed. For the first time in his reign, the king hesitated. The scribes, sworn to neutrality, took the journal and began reading passages aloud, comparing the handwriting to known samples from Captain Darren. It matched. The ink was dated. The seal was authentic. There was no denying it. Then came the twist. As the scribes pored over the text, one of them noticed something. A second set of notes in the margins, written in a different hand but from the same period. It was a record of payments made from the royal treasury to the Broken Circle, specifically for the assassination of witnesses. The guildmaster herself had kept a ledger, and a page of it was tucked into the journal as a receipt. That paper bore the king's personal signet. It wasn't just a general's overreach, it was a conspiracy that ran directly to the crown's accounts. The chamber fell into a stunned silence. Then a lord rose, then another, and soon a chorus demanded the king step down. The royal guard hesitated. The assembly's own security forces, the Grey Watch, marched into the hall, their allegiance sworn to the law, not the man. The king's face went pale. He tried to flee through a rear exit, but the Morngul delegation blocked it, Kaelin appearing from the crowd, her scarred face alight with a fierce joy. You took our lands, our children, our honor. You will not escape. In the chaos, a figure slipped from the shadows, the guildmaster, knife drawn, lunging at Brant. Vara intercepted her, blades clashing in a deadly dance before the entire assembly. This time, Vara was not fighting to kill. She was fighting to protect. She disarmed the guildmaster with a move that broke her wrist, then held her at blade point while the Grey Watch took her into custody. The guildmaster's eyes were wild. You were one of us. You betrayed the circle for a human cripple. Vara said, I chose mercy. That is the opposite of betrayal. With the journal's evidence undeniable, the king was arrested by the Grey Watch. The assembly voted to suspend the monarchy and hold a new trial for all accused. The false flag was officially recognized as a crime, and the Morngul clan was exonerated, their lands restored, their dead honored. The Broken Circle was outlawed, its remaining members scattered or captured. General Vorath and his co-conspirators were taken in chains. But the greatest surprise came when the scribes examined the journal further. Hidden in its binding was a final entry, written by the captain after the massacre, describing a soldier he had pulled from the trench, a young man with a shattered leg, whom he had secretly transported to a field hospital and given a false identity to protect. That soldier was Brant. The captain had not only recorded the crime, he had saved Brant's life, then gone into hiding, eventually dying of wounds. Brant had never known the name of the medic who dragged him out of the trench. Now he did. Captain Elric Darren. The man who had given his life to preserve the truth had been the same man who had given Brant a second chance. Brant stood on the podium, tears cutting through the grime on his face. Vara placed a hand on his back. The assembly fell quiet. "I was a ghost," Brant said. "Now I am a witness. Let this be the last time we bury the truth." In the aftermath, the capital was in turmoil, but justice had been served. The Eastern Reach Embassy was a safe haven for the heroes, but they knew they could not stay forever. The ambassador offered them asylum, but Brant and Vara had other plans. They would return to the frontier, not to hide, but to rebuild. Thera and the Morngul survivors invited them to the reclaimed lands. Vara would train a new order of guardians, not assassins, dedicated to protecting witnesses and rekindling trust between humans and orcs. Brant would write an account of the war, using the journal as a foundation, ensuring that the fallen were remembered not as statistics, but as names and stories. The day they left the capital, the sun broke through the storm clouds for the first time in a week. Brant limped down the embassy steps, Vara at his side. They were not running anymore. They were walking toward a future they had forged from the ashes of betrayal. And somewhere behind them, the bell of the assembly hall tolled, not for war, but for a new dawn. The final note hung in the air as they reached the city gates, where a single figure waited, Edris, the archivist, who had survived the decoy mission and made his way to the capital. He held a satchel of his own, copies of the journal, ready to be spread across the continent. "The truth is free," he said. "Now let's make sure it stays that way." They embraced, three unlikely survivors of a conspiracy that had almost consumed them. The story was over, but the next chapter was just beginning. The truth of that valley changed the course of a kingdom, but it began with a single refusal. Vara could have killed Brant without hesitation. She was a weapon, trained to obey. Yet in that dusty kitchen, she saw a broken man who had nothing and decided he was not her enemy. One choice, made in a heartbeat, unraveled a conspiracy that spanned continents. Brant never asked for this role. He wanted to be left alone with his silence and his crutch. But when an orc assassin lowered her blade and asked for soup, he didn't turn her away. He gave her stew and a corner of his floor, and in doing so, he gave himself a reason to fight again. Not for a flag or a general, but for the person who had seen him and chosen mercy. The unlikely pair set off a chain reaction they could never have predicted. Their flight through the passes, the caves, the ashfield, and the storm-tossed airship forced a reckoning that had been festering for a decade. The evidence they carried was more than a journal. It was a mirror held up to a nation that had built its peace on a grave of lies. And when the mirror shattered in the assembly hall, no amount of royal outrage could glue it back together. But the story doesn't end in that chamber. It echoes in every place where power tries to silence the powerless. It lives in the archives that Edris will spread, in the training grounds where Vara will teach young orcs and humans to wield protection instead of assassination, and in the pages Brant will write to give names back to the dead. The question that lingers is not whether justice was served, it's whether we would have done the same. When faced with an enemy who is just as tired, just as broken, just as human or orc as we are, would we lower the blade? Would we ask for soup instead of demanding blood? That is the heart of this tale, not grand armies or political chess, but two outcasts who found trust in the last place either expected, each other. If this story meant something to you, let it live beyond this screen. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what moment struck you most. Share it with someone who needs to hear that even the most broken among us can change the world. The fire in that cabin is out, but the light it sparked is still spreading. Don't let it die here.